Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks to everyone who's with us today. Um, I'll try not to go on too long because I'd very much like to give you all a chance to ask questions. Yes, I'd sort of have a career with one foot in the practitioner camp and one foot a little bit as the ex-anthropology, social anthropology student who observes and watches or tries to watch a bit more objectively what's going on. I'm going to talk in four parts. Briefly, very briefly, I'm going to talk about what's gone well and what's gone less well over the past couple of decades. And then probably the main part I want to draw your attention to is why have there been drawbacks, or what in a volume back in 2007 we called collateral damage caused by anti-trafficking interventions. Then in part three, I'll talk a bit about some specific drawbacks, but I've published on these, others have too, and the conference has touched on quite a lot of adverse human rights impacts. So I won't spend an enormous amount of time on that. And then finally, I will touch on some potential remedies for this downside. And that's because I'm not an academic that can say this is all awful imperialism or awful oppressive government activity. I've met people who've been abused and exploited in horrible ways, and I really want to see something positive done for them. And I think it could be done much better than it is at the moment. So first of all, what's gone well? Compared to the 1990s or the late 20th century, in many countries there's a much better understanding now of what constitutes abusive exploitation. All sorts of methods have been developed for detecting illegal exploitation, extreme exploitation, and to identify the people involved, adults and children. That's been positive for some of them, but not everyone. There's been some good jurisprudence from two regional human rights courts, the European Court of Human Rights that we've heard about in this conference, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which I talk about mainly because I gave them some evidence in a case back in 2016, a Brazil case. Here's just a couple of references. I'm not going to go into detail because they've been mentioned earlier, of the European Court of Human Rights. It does seem extraordinary, doesn't it, that for a court established 60 years earlier, there'd only been about one not very meaningful case on forced labor in the 20th century. It's only since the UN Trafficking Protocol was adopted that we've really seen the European Court move on the issue of forced labor and human rights. Here are details. Here's the title of the American case, and I've already in the chat boxes yesterday given some references to where the English copy of the judgment is. So those are things that have gone well. And that the point about the regional court cases, of course, is that these are not prosecutions of traffickers. These are prosecutions of states for failing to uphold human rights. And I'm just confirming that because so often there's a real confusion caused by the assertion that human trafficking is a violation of human rights. So let me come back to that in a minute and talk about where there's been a bit of progress, but it's been painfully slow. Well, policymakers, police and others have been very slow to understand what constitutes servitude, forced labor, human trafficking, and so on. Or in the last 6 years since the British decided to rebrand modern slavery. There was the initial assumption, particularly among law enforcement, that it was all about vice and the sex industry. And only earlier this year, I and others were involved in designing yet another course to promote understanding of what trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation actually consists of, because so little is still done about it. What's been terribly slow and still doesn't happen in most countries is that policymakers don't listen to trafficking victims, adults or children. I wrote a book about this in 2007 or 8, or more or less a book, and I thought it would make a difference, and it made absolutely no difference. So it's been very disillusioning. There's been next to no meaningful prevention, and the things that have been called prevention haven't prevented. So a big problem there. And finally, there's been progress in the mechanisms in many countries to identify trafficked persons as a first step to protecting them, but often very slow, deliberately slow, because people in government don't want to make the protection and assistance available to substantial numbers, and often also because of the reluctance of the people concerned, because there was either no advantage to them in being identified, or there were some very substantial disadvantages to them, as we'll come onto in a moment. So, part 2, why have there been drawbacks? I've got a whole long list, and I'm only going to touch on some of them today. First of all, terminology. Here are just a few points. I've heard complaints about the term vulnerability, which I dislike, already mentioned. The first problem is that trafficking was co-opted to mean something more than recruitment into the commercial sex sector, but that was what it was always understood by police around the world to refer to. Secondly, it was defined as a result of protracted intergovernmental negotiations as a three-stage offence, and in many countries it was put as such straight into the statute books, and it's very difficult to prove all the stages, and it's complicated, and it needn't have been that, because there could have been a focus on the forms of exploitation, in which case recruitment is, or perhaps a first stage, but instead the focus was put on the recruitment into exploitation. Thirdly, again, it's already been raised, the title of the international law referring to trafficking insisted that women and children were the main victims. So men automatically lost out until there was enough evidence to point out there were a lot of them. And I still hear, even at this conference, meaningless statistics coming from organizations that are only reporting on what law enforcement people have identified in terms of victims, that skew the proportions of men, women, boys and girls around in a damaging way. And it's important to remember that back in 2000, there were 2 protocols to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child adopted as well. One of those was about the sale of children and went into a great deal of detail on protection and definition of offences, and that was effectively shunted aside by the focus on trafficking. Another terminology problem has been introduction of the term modern slavery, and the reason that it was such a problem is because it was parachuted into the Sustainable Development Goals at a late stage by the United Kingdom without ensuring consensus. So the result was that they broke an existing consensus on use of the term trafficking in persons. I suppose there was a strategic objective in all that. I'm not sure what it was. I don't think it's been very helpful. A few more drawbacks. As I said, the term trafficking brought a focus on recruitment processes rather than the forms of abusive exploitation in themselves. Now, in fact, far more required to be done about recruitment, and the ILO has picked up on that a bit. But yeah, the definition, frankly, could have been much better, and it would have avoided some of its intrinsic disadvantages if it hadn't focused on recruitment and implicitly, therefore, on questions of irregular migration as well. Fourthly, and I think this is important, is that all sorts of players have been able to portray themselves as anti-trafficking or anti-slavery activists upholding human rights. And many of those, including non-governmental organizations, don't respect human rights at all. Some of them that I visited as a trustee of a UN fund were really not human rights friendly at all. Some of the governments that claim to have human rights approaches are human rights violators. It's a real problem. So it's been a way of upending the human rights agenda to an extent that I don't think human rights organizations have understood or responded to adequately. Finally, in this list, what that's meant is that not only have rights been ignored, but there's been a lack of attention to some key rights questions relating to discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, national origin, and so on. Those, in my view, are key issues when it comes to preventing severe forms of exploitation. Let me move on from that list and talk a little bit more about some of the concepts which are key and which are, in a sense, inherently disadvantageous to the people that you and I might like to protect and assist. Trafficking is defined as a crime, as a deviancy that has to be cured by law enforcement, rather than as a social norm that requires changing, which, for example, in South Asia, the patterns of bonded labor that go back centuries, or serfdom in parts of Central America, have been regarded not as something that criminal law could remedy. Indeed, in India, a Supreme Court judge wrote a very interesting judgment in the 1980s explaining why it was a bad idea to use criminal justice to repress bonded labor. The advantage for states is that by focusing on individual criminals, they don't have to adjust their policies or tackle the structural causes that cause or facilitate trafficking. And indeed, I would go further and say this is part of a right-wing conservative agenda to blame bad people, bad hombres. Do you know that phrase? So we see it particularly coming from not just the Conservative Party in Britain, but or the Republicans in the States, or white Australia, but in particular from those conservative political sources. Throughout, I'm going to repeat that meaningful prevention was avoided because the focus was on a crime. There've been a lot of money spent on what is called prevention, mostly to do with propaganda, publicity, and it's had remarkably little positive effect. Since 2012, we've seen people nicknamed philanthro-capitalists coming up and playing a major role. Sorry, I've jumped something. So yes, I've referred to modern slavery as an undefined category, and a big problem that has come up because of the focus on recruitment has been the umbilical cord between trafficking and irregular immigration. This has been particularly obvious in the United Kingdom, which regarded trafficking initially as an immigration crime, solely as an immigration crime. So there was a real political will, dare I say, there not to understand that focusing on exploitation didn't mean necessarily stopping people at the border. And that focus on immigration has been, frankly, perverse. Let me talk a little bit about some of the findings on Vietnamese and others that I've seen. I noticed it back in 2009 when a Labour Home Secretary praised the destruction of the jungle camp near 2009, near Calais, as if it was going to save people from being trafficked, when those of us who knew the first thing about trafficking knew that the immediate result would be to make life much more difficult and debts higher for people who were in the jungle and were under the control of traffickers. All sorts of other destructive things have been done in the name of stopping trafficking. The two photographs here are from outside Lens in northern France, where there was a transit center known as Vietnam City. It was well known to the British and French authorities, and for a long while they thought it better to let it function so that they could watch what was going on. Eventually, pressure from the British led to it being bulldozed 18 months before the 39 deaths in the lorry that you will have all heard about. More recently, for political gain, I saw the UK Home Office claiming in March this year, at the beginning of its efforts to reform immigration legislation, that child rapists had benefited from protection of the UK's NRM. Well, in that case, maybe the Home Office is dysfunctional and should do something about it. But to justify on the basis of some yet unspecified cases, this is just politicians playing with issues in a disgraceful way. Now my real problem, the dynamics of power. So thank you very much to Chabdai's founder, Helen, for mentioning this earlier. Well, straight away back in 2000, indeed even before, we saw that the USA wanted to be global leader on stopping human trafficking. I saw them doing this as a fig leaf while the George Bush administration introduced something similar to Hitler's Nacht und Nebel, disappearing people into torture chambers. I've seen other governments do it, seizing the limelight with less nefarious consequences, such as Theresa May's call for action in 2017. There have been all sorts of collateral damage is too mild a phrase to say, from the way that powerful Western governments have manipulated issues. And beyond governments, we've got the problem that most or a lot of trafficking initiatives are headed by white people who are again seen to be saving the world. And when they are willing to go into the background and support the efforts of local activists, I can admire them, but in many cases they haven't. And now on to the philanthropists that I mentioned earlier, the philanthro-capitalists who came in following Andrew Forrest, the Australian billionaire, in 2012, providing a lot of money to anti-slavery initiatives, but definitely in many cases not committed to human rights. Some of them are, but some of them determinedly not. And money has gone to all sorts of people and initiatives which have again not been supportive of human rights. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime has made a lot of money. Various other intergovernmental organizations, indeed I've watched cutthroat battles among them to get funds, particularly from the US. We've seen struggles among NGOs. Some of them, like the International Justice Mission, have grown positively fat on the basis of money available in the last 2 decades. We've seen a new initiative, a sort of extension of American foreign policy called the Global Fund for the Eradication of Modern Slavery, where anti-slavery experts such as the Catholic Bishop of London are on the board. Lots of prominence, lots of prizes, I have to say, you know, it's been appalling to watch most of it. Well, now let me be a bit more specific and talk about some of the adverse impacts for the people involved. As I said earlier, I'm not going to go into great detail here. Some of it's been documented elsewhere. Early on, we noticed restrictions on either immigration or emigration of women. I've noticed it particularly in the case of Nepal, where from time to time different governments come up with suggestions that women migrant workers are being exploited badly in the Middle East or in India or somewhere else, so they ban women or women of certain age groups from emigrating. Even in the late 90s, we saw Germany putting severe restrictions on women from Philippines or Thailand, because even when they married German citizens, some were then exploited in prostitution. So blanket initiatives affecting large numbers of people in a quite disproportionate way. We've already heard a lot about the negative impact of anti-trafficking practice on non-trafficked sex workers. They're not just collateral damage, they seem to be regarded as completely acceptable to impact them in many countries, impact them in a negative way from their best interest point of view. We've seen independent child migrants categorized as trafficking victims in many countries. And this miscategorization, when it happens, seems to result in the action taken to protect them being ineffective. They don't want to be protected in many cases, or the sort of protection made available is ineffective. And we've seen genuine trafficking victims, that's to say people who committed crimes because they were not in control of their own actions at the time that they were under the control of traffickers, sometimes categorized as criminals. There was a judgment earlier this year of the European Court of Human Rights concerning a couple of Vietnamese boys convicted in the UK back in 2009, when, it's worth pointing out, the current head of Britain's Labour Party was in charge of the prosecution service. We've seen initially particularly a lot of assistance and protection to trafficking victims made conditional on presumed victims being willing to provide evidence. This was sort of implicit in the UN trafficking protocol. And in effect, it was saying, if you want to be given any treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, you've got to put your head in the lion's mouth. It was so unacceptable as to leave you sort of, well, your jaw drops. Absolutely extraordinary that anyone involved in law enforcement could have engaged in that. Fortunately, the need for an alternative approach is now recognized in many countries. And just this week, I sat through a long session organized by the OSCE in Vienna, talking about how demand, which should be discouraged, demand for trafficking should be discouraged, really meant that the commercial sex industry should be closed down. Once again, we were back to manipulation of language, what many of us have nicknamed the Swedish model of making men who pay for sex criminals, is now being labeled an equality model. Yes, language is endlessly being manipulated. Interestingly, I noticed that Ireland and France were being praised for implementing this model. Earlier today, we seem to hear, and it's what I've heard repeatedly, that Ireland has a lousy anti-trafficking system, so does France. So it does seem that this model is popular in countries that don't want to do much about the broad swathe of forms of exploitation linked to trafficking. Now let me talk very specifically about supply chains. And this illustration, although you can't see the detail, refers to both tomatoes from Italy and fish from fishing vessels owned by Thai business people. Governments have appeared remarkably hopeless at responding on a state-to-state basis when they're having imports made by trafficked victims of slavery imported into their countries. So I just wanted to refer briefly to a case involving a very high level of exploitation in Thai fishing vessels, where I wrote to my MP back in 2010, having monitored the situation for about 5 years by then, and got back a very polite letter about yes, there'd been an exchange between the UK and the Thailand on this. It led to absolutely no change, and indeed it wasn't until Western media denounced slave labour in the Thai fishing fleet in 2013-14 that Thai businesses, and particularly businesses with being supplied from Thailand, insisted on a cleanup. We've seen adverse impacts from efforts to influence supply chains elsewhere. I noticed it back in 2001 onwards, after a focus on cocoa, when we had some silly British minister claiming that children who were being moved from one part of West Africa to another, which was all about growing cocoa, when it wasn't. But what we did see later on was a new anti-trafficking organization called Stop the Traffic, focusing on the issue of cocoa. BBC reporting that 12,000 children were growing cocoa in West Africa, others saying you should boycott, not eat chocolate. Yeah, lots of hot air about this issue, most of it quite problematic because it wasn't based on the evidence available. Here in the UK, we saw the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and others support a campaign against hand car washes. Now, the interesting thing there was that, of course, petrol companies who were operating garages with mechanized car washes had a very vested interest on this issue. And you could see car washes as a good form of intermediate technology and a good source of income for irregular migrants, but not necessarily slave labor. Clearly bad for the environment. But what was the issue? Well, here's the headline in the Daily Express, and it was echoed throughout the media about slaves working at car washes. And many people in the churches, not only the Church of England, but others, were urged to take action on this. And I'm sure there were cases of people trafficked or people in forced labor, but there were a great many that weren't, and that's the problem. So what is it about boycotts? Well, I want to take you far away to Brazil, where I was given lessons back at the end of the 1990s on this. And the person who talked to me explained that it was very easy to call for boycotts in inappropriate circumstances. His name, he died a year or two ago, a French friar who'd worked for a couple of decades in Brazil and was the key lawyer preparing the case that went to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Green Brazil ranch case. And I talked to him about the cattle that were being the beef that came from cattle on the ranches that had been cleared by slave labor, and whether there should be a boycott of Brazilian beef. And he was absolutely clear on this. He said no, because there were some ranches that were really avoiding the use of slave labor, that were, as if you like, the good practice cases, to punish them would be an unjustifiable mistake, he said. So, why have there been so many drawbacks to this framework over the last 2 decades and so little done to correct them? Is it, I'm afraid I'm going to be rhetorical here, is it ignorance or lack of training? Is it willful blindness, the opposite of political will? Certainly seems to me quite often that it's like Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen, a deliberate blindness not to see the collateral damage that's occurring. Is it idealism? Well, you know, we're willing to sacrifice a few because the benefits of abolishing the sex industry, for example, or stopping children migrating when they should be living with their loving families. Is it that? Or is it political interests? Certainly, I can see that the US has benefited a lot, and I felt that Mrs. Theresa May had opted for the Wilberforce halo in the case of the UK. It's only recently that I saw it described quite accurately by some academics as path dependence. Here is what they've said, and here is the source. I just regarded it as sort of negative momentum. Something is on the statute books and, oh, it's too soon to change, we can't do anything about it. But maybe it really is a little bit more of, a bit more explainable in terms of path dependence. Either way, there are plenty of ways in which the drawbacks could be reduced. I wouldn't say that within the existing framework they could be eliminated entirely. The first is that prevention and protection could both be evidence-based. Although I see a lot of calls for new research and more evidence, there's a massive amount that's already available. Indeed, I think back in 2002, we made a pretty good stab when I and others helped develop the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommended principles on human rights and human trafficking to point out how it should be done. But definitely what's needed is action to be taken on the basis of what happens in reality, rather than on a sort of checklist approach coming from either the US government or from various ideologically or religiously motivated players. Prevention can be much more substantial and much more effective. It doesn't need to mention trafficking or modern slavery in many cases. It certainly doesn't need to be done by law enforcement. It does need to focus on structural causes, not just of trafficking, but of people moving in unsafe ways into precarious situations. It needs to focus on discrimination and extremes of inequality, and it needs to focus on promoting respect for human rights rather than ignoring human rights as at present. And certainly a great deal more can be done by focusing on supply chains, on the services and goods purchased from dodgy sources. A lot more can be done than was started 10 years ago in California in terms of making statements public by companies. And that was picked up, although it wasn't originally an idea of the British government, it was picked up in the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. So a lot more can be done. There are some do's and don'ts. I always point out that trafficking flourishes in the areas where the rule of law doesn't reach. This means ensuring that labor relations in no part of the economy are outside the rule of the law. Often they are in the case of the sex industry, parts of the informal sector, migrant domestic workers, workers in various isolated places, whether it's a forest in Amazonia or even a fishing vessel in the Atlantic. I think there's a key lesson that we can learn, which is that prohibition creates opportunities for criminals to take control. It creates a vacuum. So unless you really want to do harm, don't create a grey economy in which certain behavior is tolerated or allowed, even though it's theoretically illegal. I'm always worried about that in the case of the sex industry. So if governments choose either to regulate or to ban, the government concerned really has an obligation to make resources available to follow through rather than to leave it as silly rhetoric. And that means, for example, that conventional labour inspectorates need their mandates and working methods to be amended. Now, we have seen that happen in the UK. The UK Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authorities, as it's now known, for me, really does represent a good practice in a continent where otherwise labour inspectorates languished in the pre-1989 era for far too long. There are all sorts of alternative approaches that can be taken also in relation to protection. Identification doesn't have to be left to the criminal justice system. I heard well what Christina was saying earlier today about the advantages, but I can see huge advantages to the victims themselves in delinking any assistance to them and the process of identifying them from the criminal justice system or the immigration system. And of course, the protection that's given and which states themselves have an obligation to support needs to allow for full recovery. We've heard that mentioned. Full recovery doesn't usually happen in 2 or 3 weeks, particularly for someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not going to go into details on children, but in children it's crystal clear. All the governments that have signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's to say virtually everyone except for the US, has a very strong legal obligation to do something that most countries don't at the present do. So let me conclude. What do I mean by a centennial initiative? There's so much wrong at the moment that in the run-up to the centenary of the League of Nations Slavery Convention, which was adopted in 1926, in the 5 years that are left, I wonder whether we should be calling for new international standards or putting a special effort on filling in all the loopholes that I and others have pointed out. The problem since 1926 is that international law has required abolition, but initially said nothing about how people who had been enslaved should be protected and assisted, and it said nothing about prevention. The big problem is that there is currently in the international community no appetite for anything new. Indeed, I don't think if we were to try and revisit not just the trafficking convention, the trafficking protocol, but other international law adopted between 1998 and 2000, I don't think any of it would get through these days. Finally, I want to point nevertheless out that us in Europe are relatively lucky. We do have a human rights-based convention on the issue of trafficking with what has so far been a very competent treaty monitoring body known as Greta. We can build on this and we can influence it. I think we're luckier certainly than those in Asia or Africa or any of the parts of America, even though those in America, like in Europe, have a regional human rights court which is doing or able to do positive things. So there's a little bit of hope. I'm sorry if I'm ending on a fairly negative note, but I'm afraid the last 20 years justifies that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. And now back to you, Josh, and Gillian to chair the rest of the session.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, I've got a bit of feed echo back there. Thank you so much. That was such a brilliant, in-depth, and also covered so much in so much time, in a short space of time. Yeah, thank you so much for that. We've already got a question coming in, so I will just crack on if you'll allow, just so we can make the most of the time we have with you. This one from CRJJ Riken. Wonderful presentation, Mike. During the conference, we've heard some critical reflections on human trafficking as a violation of human rights, or human trafficking as a human rights concern / problem. What is your take on this? That's from Connie. Sorry, that's Connie.
Well, Connie, I know well, because we've sat around the same table where this was debated. Some of us old-fashioned people who were trained before 1929 or even 1989 were lectured by people like Professor Nigel Rodley at Essex University to understand that states were the main actors that violate human rights and are responsible for upholding human rights. So it's very clear that in some circumstances, when states haven't acted with due diligence, that they are the ones responsible for human rights violations of people who've been trafficked. I don't think it makes much sense when my wife hits me for me to claim that that's not just domestic abuse, but a violation of my human rights. It would be if the state does nothing about it. And I think that probably reflects my view on trafficking. When we talked about it in 2000 and 2001, we were very clear that it was an abuse of human rights, but that using the word violations, which really referred to a state violating human rights, wasn't very helpful. So there was that sort of trying to distinguish between state accountability and what criminals or others, including NGOs, do that's abusive and needs correcting. I think that's always important. And I know that Connie, as a member of Greta, will have some opportunities to follow through on this. So I look forward in seeing the right things coming out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really helpful and really useful distinction to make. Gillian has come in with a comment or question as well. She said, thank you for a very insightful presentation, Mike. Really appreciated the acknowledgement that while there isn't much appetite for treaty change, a good focus could be on best leveraging and operationalizing the norms which do exist. My chat's jumped. Agree that the COE system and Greta as a monitoring body is a good example of both promise and progress, despite the weaknesses. Don't know if you want to reflect on any of those comments there.
I think it's worth referring everybody not only to the existence of Greta, but particularly to their annual reports. They've published 10 of them so far. Initially, Greta as a treaty monitoring body was looking fairly narrowly at what each country was doing to observe the Council of Europe Trafficking Convention. And it up until last year had refrained from producing what other treaty monitoring bodies in the UN system particularly have done, which is to produce general comments or general recommendations. Now it's started doing so. I'm quite pleased that they've issued some guidance. So far their focus has been on what an individual state does. And the disadvantage to that is that to respond to any transnational trafficking pattern, you have to deal with at least 2 states at once. And indeed, in Europe, for example, to deal with the pattern that's been mentioned already of women coming from Nigeria's Edo state to various parts of Europe, you've got to deal with a non-Council of Europe country as well, Nigeria. At least in Europe, Greta has to start dealing with several countries at once, because sometimes the quality of cooperation is woeful. I mean, I would say there are some countries which were so disinclined to cooperate that really Greta needs to focus on that. So there's more to do. But there's a big problem with the UN protocol. It doesn't have a treaty monitoring body, or not an effective one yet. And the same applies to the US, to the rest of the America regions, and to Asia, which has had ASEAN has had a very specific convention adopted a few years ago. But unless you have that sort of independent monitoring, a lot of those treaties become just the words of the powerful, the words of governments, with no one looking after the interests of ordinary people. Back to you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's just popped up on my screen, 5 minutes till the end of the session. I don't know if you know anything about that, Gillian. I do hope it's not going to cut us off. Maya has come in with a question. Thanks so much for this interesting, comprehensive presentation. You talked about structural causes in the context of prevention. Do you see immigration restrictions as a structural cause? And if so, how can this be remedied?
Well, certainly immigration restrictions have also cause all sorts of things. No, I wasn't really seeing that as a structural cause, but I think unless you look at the specific effect that immigration barriers have, then you're not able to respond to everything that needs responding to. I think we need always much more evidence about how states are manipulating immigration restrictions, including things like lorry checks, to be sure that they are not provoking problems as well as protecting their frontiers. I do think most of the structural issues are long-term ones, ones that by and large aren't even documented. It's not just to do with discrimination against women and girls, poverty. There were a whole load of things that were listed in the UN trafficking protocol, which were a little bit trite because the people that put them down were not experts in analyzing structural causes. In fact, virtually no research had been accomplished by 2000 that was really interesting on the issue of causes. But for example, I'm going to refer again to the one I've already mentioned, women and girls coming from Edo State. The issue of discrimination in terms of property ownership, in terms of who can run businesses, in terms of a whole wide set of social norms in many areas from which women and girls in particular are trafficked, are vital to do something about, and very few preventive projects do anything substantial. And you know, it was tragic in the case of Britain. The former DFID had started financing an initiative in Nigeria, and then suddenly, boom, dropped it last year because the country was feeling a little bit poor as a result of having a new government and COVID. But there we are. You know, this is the way that politicians seem to think it's reasonable to act.
I wonder, Mike, I'll stick in my little question here. I think, because we've got a few questions, I think if I say we'll probably go 10 minutes over, and it will probably be 5:40 when we bring it to a close, because I think there's a few more things people would like to hear from. And I'd like to ask a question. You spoke earlier about work that you've done that has not had the kind of response and the reaction that you, in the past, that you had hoped that it would have. And I wonder whether you have any reflections on the kind of more general political and economic place we're at. There certainly seems, in relation, including to things around COVID and some of the things that are coming from institutions like IMF or from the Biden administration or OSCE, that there's greater social unrest, there's perhaps greater demands coming from populations for changes than there have been previously in the last couple of decades. I mean, there was after the crash, but it kind of status quo returned. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or not necessarily predictions, but any wonderings about how that wider political economic context might start to, or have the potential to impact upon these issues around trafficking and migration frameworks?
Well, despite the fact that I've said it's been dreadful that there's been such a focus on the recruitment stage and on migration instead of on exploitation, I'll certainly say, look, migration isn't going to go down. The government international response in the form of the Global Compact was pathetic. It was still pretending that migration shouldn't happen, needn't happen. And the people who voted in that way were mostly the governments who'd exported millions of their citizens in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You know, it's been so unreal as to be ridiculous, and that's where we're stuck. So if, and it isn't an if there is significant climate change, then at a very minimum we expect large-scale population movement. Now, one response is a law and order one. I've seen this under the trafficking framework in China, for example, going back 15 years when I was evaluating a regional project in Southeast Asia. It was very apparent that with the large-scale move from country area to the cities within China, so we're not even talking about transnational migration, that the police there saw anti-trafficking instruments as something very useful to control people and to minimize popular uprisings, in effect, in the cities, which resulted from people being tricked and exploited. I think at the moment, those of us who see ourselves as human rights defenders are on a losing streak. But I think that unless we can strengthen that, that we're conceding to, in effect, to dictatorship, not just to right-wing populism, in a way that will be desperately sad for our descendants as well as for the current generations. So there's a huge amount that's riding on it. And it's why I think that in the next 5 years, whatever we think about the League of Nations Convention, I think we should put a lot more focus on pointing out what's gone wrong and what could be done to remedy it, and then start like that little Dutch boy or girl, sticking our fingers in the dike in the wall to try and fill some of the gaps.
Thank you. Brilliant. Amy Wedderburn has said, I would be interested to know more about your thoughts on the emphasis on demand, and in particular the difficulties that we face when such a narrow, misguided emphasis is being championed by those in a position of power, e.g., as we have seen this week with the Swedish chairmanship of OSCE. It appears to once again be a way for states to deflect from their obligations, i.e. to provide resources for labour inspectorates, etc.
Well, Amy's taken the words out of my mouth. I sat with some degree of horror through sessions that were saying we should wave a magic wand and get rid of the sex industry and we'd solve the problem. Of course, there's lots of problems where if we could wave a magic wand, we would solve them. Let's wave a magic wand and send everyone back to where they came from. Donald Trump can go back to Germany, and you know, it's just ridiculous. So is the so-called Swedish model any more realistic than others? I'm not convinced it is. I've had to write quite a lot about demand myself, and I think the key thing is to see who we can influence that has demand. If it is individual consumers, it's really difficult. If it is, as it were, the wholesalers along a supply chain, which it is in, let's say, the case of cocoa or all sorts of other products, then there's much more leverage on them. Is there an advantage in, let's say, banning chocolate or banning consumption of coffee when some abuse is found, or even a lot of abuse is found in the areas where those products come from? I have a lot of doubts there, and I'm particularly worried when it comes to those primary agricultural products, which were promoted for a century during the century of empire to benefit those in Western Europe and North America. And suddenly now we have people who've never visited a cocoa farm who are saying how awful it is that people have to wander around. Well, particularly it was the ILO that said it was very dangerous for children to be given a machete to cut cocoa trees with, whereas most of us who've been in a West African cocoa farm think it'd be rather dangerous to send a child there without shoes. That would be seriously dangerous, and dangerous without a machete, because then you got nothing to cut the snake's head off with. So, you know, we've seen such illogic applied, not only in relation to trafficking, in relation to child labor and exploitation of people more generally. That's been really, really damaging and sad.
Thank you. Jing has said, thanks for your keynote, Mike. I agree that demand and prevention are narrowly focused. Can you give examples of more meaningful prevention efforts?
Wow, let me start thinking off the top of my head. Well, yes, I can, because I've been doing some work, for example, in relation to the Western Balkans recently. And initially there, because a relatively high proportion of the children being trafficked were from various Roma communities, initially the main prevention work that was being done was once a year on the 18th of October, the European Union Anti-Trafficking Day. Leaflets would be distributed, the Procurator General would make a speech, and Roma people would be told that it was terribly bad to take their children out of school and let them go to work or be trafficked by others. It was a lot of hot air. So a social worker who comes across a deprived community where almost by definition not only young but older people are being exploited in all sorts of horrible ways, knows from decades of experience that there are some very practical things to be done. First of all, identifying the households most at risk, usually giving them material support, using social protection programs in a really imaginative way with direct results. And in parts of the Balkans, that's been led by NGOs with a lot of social work experience, and then the expertise transferred to state social services, which in much of the Balkans were sort of office-based workers in the past. And so learning what social work involves has taken more than a decade. It's not a quick fix, but that leads to results in a way that accusing someone of trafficking their children or accusing other people of exploiting children really doesn't. And indeed, one of the big problems of the trafficking agenda in Southeast Europe is that it is being used in a racist way to accuse Roma of being in favor of exploitation. I mean, it's been horrible to watch.
Thank you. We've got one more question from Elizabeth Faulkner that I'll pose to you, and then we will finally wrap up. She writes, you mentioned collateral damage, and I link it with the issues of unintended harms. How can we continue to call them or label anti-trafficking as unintended when research has pointed out forcefully that the harms I'm thinking in relation to children?
Well, I used to use the word unintended or unexpected. And I've actually gone back to this term that is used in the Ruggie principles, the UN Business and Human Rights principles, adverse human rights impacts. Adverse impacts, maybe they are really intended. Certainly in the case of impacts on the sex industry, they are clearly intended, but they're not stated explicitly. There's a great deal still really to be understood about what conversations have occurred in the 1990s onwards among those who have planned and then manipulated the anti-trafficking agenda, and indeed what go on each year, for example, in big funders, whether it's the US State Department or others, because although what comes to the surface looks like good intentions, often we know that some of the conversations that have planned them have not been about good intentions. And indeed, even if things are good intentions, I think it's way before the year 2000 that we invented the phrase that says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So either way, yes, Elizabeth, you're right to point out that we need better language. And I think, as I think about this kind of idea of a centennial initiative, I think that it is essential to rebrand some of the language. If someone wants to call something that I regard as pretty abusive an equality model, then I've got to come up with an equally Stalinist approach to language. But I find that difficult to do. So maybe some of the rest of you can take on that role.
Brilliant. Centennial, as in the 1926 Slavery Convention.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Mike, thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time and with your knowledge and experience over the last 2 days, and that presentation was really, really great. So thank you so much for that. Unless any of the other team have anything else to add, I'm sure we will be in touch in the near future just for ongoing ways to connect with the Human Trafficking Research Network for any of you that want to continue earlier this year, and I think again in the near future before the next symposium there'll probably be another work in progress session and other ways to connect and network so that lots of what's begun here can carry on. So thank you so much everyone for contributing over the last couple of days. I hope you have a really great weekend, and thanks again to Mike. Take care everyone, and goodbye.